Thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Carly Fiorina. Carly's a voice that I think more people should listen to about economic growth and entrepreneurship and effective leadership. Those of you who are proponents of a liberal arts education will be happy to know that she studied medieval history and philosophy as an undergraduate at Stanford. She became the first woman ever to lead a Fortune 50 company. Her career demonstrates that there are many different paths to successful leadership. Character plays a role, and some knowledge of Aristotle can't hurt. Carly's father, Joe Sneed, was a wonderful man who served as the dean of the Duke Law School and deputy attorney general, and then as a judge on the Ninth Circuit. His daughter started work as a secretary for a small real estate business. She eventually joined AT&T in an entry-level sales position, and she rose through the ranks and became the first female officer at AT&T. 15 years later, she led AT&T's spin-out of Lucent Technologies and ran their $23 billion North American operations. In 1999, Carly was recruited by Hewlett-Packard, and during the worst technology recession in 25 years, she refocused the company on innovation and market leadership. Under her leadership, revenues grew, innovation tripled, growth quadrupled, and Hewlett-Packard grew to be the 11th largest company in the United States. During her tenure, Hewlett-Packard received numerous civic recognitions. It was named one of the 100 best corporate citizens by Business Ethics magazine. It was named one of the 100 best companies for working mothers by Working Mother magazine. Since leaving Hewlett-Packard, Carly has focused her efforts on private and public service. She served as chair of Good 360, the world's largest product philanthropy organization, and as chair of Opportunity International, a Christian-based organization that lifts millions out of poverty around the globe through microfinance. In partnership with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, she founded the One Woman Initiative to engage and empower women in Pakistan, Egypt, India, and the Philippines through increased access to economic opportunity. Carly also has experience in government, and I wish she had more. She's served as She has served as chairman of the External Advisory Board of the CIA, the Defense Business Board, and the Advisory Group on Transformational Diplomacy for the State Department. She's been a member of the U.S. Space Commission. In 2015, she launched a campaign for president. Running as a political outsider, she spoke about empowering and engaging citizens to take government back from a political ruling class that has failed to deliver results. Speaking for myself, I would have been delighted to see her as a nominee for the office. Carly continues to serve today as chairman of the Unlocking Potential Foundation, a nonprofit committed to supporting local leaders who solve problems in their own communities. She's joining us this evening to speak about the important role civil society plays in advancing our nation and solving some of its most important problems. Please join me in welcoming Carly Fiorina.
Thank you so much, President Garvey, for that very gracious introduction, and good afternoon, good evening. Great to be with all of you. You know, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the things I've learned along the way, because maybe they'll help you as you start out in your life. But mostly what I want to talk about tonight is the choices that you can make to make the world a better place. I'll begin by saying that I know you're here. You're here at Catholic University as opposed to somewhere else because you've already figured out one of the most important things in life. What you've already figured out, or you wouldn't be here, is that a life based in values is a life with a foundation. What you've already figured out is that when we separate people from their faith and their families and their communities, that people literally become unmoored. And so we need to cling close to our faith and our families and our communities, regardless of what that faith is in so many ways. So you've already learned, you already know some of the real fundamentals of life. I have to speak briefly, I must say as well, in defense of a degree in medieval history and philosophy. I know we're in the business school. How many of you are studying like history or philosophy or something where you think maybe you won't get a job? Let me give you encouragement. Several years ago, I gave the commencement speech at Stanford, and I said that the most valuable course I ever took at Stanford University was not Econ 101 or poli-sci or any of that. In fact, the most important course I ever took was an advanced course in medieval philosophy. Now, this was a course, many of you maybe don't know all that much about medieval philosophy, but you know, Thomas Aquinas was of that era, and Maimonides in the Jewish tradition. And in this course, I was required, as were all the other students, to read a complete work of one of these philosophers each and every week. Now, let me just say that the guys of the medieval times were not brief. They spent a lot of pages getting to what they wanted to say. And our assignment at the end of each week was to condense all those hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages into 2. My process for doing that was first I would write 20 pages, and then I would write 10, and then I would get it down to 5, and finally I would get it down to 2 pages. And while I don't remember all the specifics of what made Maimonides and Aquinas different beyond their obvious religious faith, what I do remember is this: that process of learning how to distill a whole lot down to its essence, that process of trying to figure out what's the core, what's the real meaning, was perhaps the most valuable skill I learned. So, for all of you who are struggling through courses, take a step back occasionally and think about what bigger thing you may be learning, what bigger skill you may be learning. Because that skill that I learned of taking a whole bunch of information and distilling it down to what I thought was its essence, that is a skill that has served me over and over and over. And indeed, I would argue that in the 21st century, a century defined by technology where you are bombarded each and every day by a tidal wave of information, much of it irrelevant, some of it interesting, but how much of it is really core, really important, really essential? That skill, I'm very grateful I learned. And I'm very certain that you are learning incredibly important skills like that along the way, even if you forget some of the specifics. So for those of you in history and philosophy, I must admit I graduated from Stanford absolutely unemployable. Take heart, there is a future. Now, by the way, because I was unemployable, I have to say I was kind of a unimaginative, goody two-shoes sort of middle child. I was a parent pleaser. Maybe some of you were parent pleasers. That's what I was. What my parents said I should do, I did. I had a more beautiful and more rebellious elder sister. I had a more rebellious and quite athletic younger brother. And I was kind of Carly, you know, unimaginative. I didn't feel particularly courageous. I did what my parents wanted me to do. And because I was unemployable, my dad suggested law school. Apologies to all the budding lawyers in the room. I went off to law school. I hated law school. It wasn't for me. My dad had a passion for the law. I had none. I had the presence of mind to decide, to realize I hated it before the very first exam. But now, as a young woman with a degree in medieval history and philosophy in the middle of a very deep recession, I decided to quit. I had the presence of mind to quit before the very first exam. And then I had to go home and tell my mom and dad I quit. It was probably the first adult decision of my life. It was no doubt the most difficult decision of my then young life. But I figured out somehow that if I hated something, if I had no passion for it, that I wasn't going to be any good at it. And I also figured out that I couldn't live my life pleasing my parents, that I was going to have to start living my life pleasing myself, or to be more accurate about it, doing what my mother had always told me I should do. My mother, when I was a little girl, said to me and said to the rest of her Sunday school class one morning, What you are is God's gift to you. What you make of yourself is your gift to God. And what my mother and my father always said to me is find your gifts. Find your God-given gifts and use them to the fullest. And that's still the best advice I've ever heard. And so I needed to do something besides law school. I had helped put myself through college as what we used to call a Kelly girl. We don't call them Kelly girls anymore. It's not correct, politically correct, that is. We call them Kelly temporary personnel. But Kelly girls were mostly women who were temporary office staff. And so I know you don't even know what I'm talking about, but what I would do is type bills of lading on an IBM Selectric typewriter. And I would answer landline phones. And that's how I put myself through Stanford. In fact, one of my best jobs was to type for the shipping department of Hewlett-Packard on that IBM Selectric typewriter. And so now with really nowhere to go and no job, having just dropped out of law school, I decided I know how to type and I know how to answer the phones. And I went back to work, accepted the very first job I was offered, which was, as President Garvey said, to type for a 9-person real estate firm. I had no ambition. I had no thought of what came next. What I was thinking, actually, is thank goodness I have a job. Thank goodness I can pay my rent. And I'm going to do the best job I know how to do. So the first pause that I would say is when you leave this place and it's time for you to go to work, don't worry about getting the perfect job. Just get a job and do the best job you can. Because if you do a really good job at whatever it is, and there is dignity and honor in all work, if done well, if you do a good job at whatever you're asked to do, someone's going to notice. And in fact, that's what happened to me. Someone noticed. 2 men in that office noticed and said, you know, we think you could do more than type and file. Do you want to know what we do? And that was my introduction to business. Eventually, I would go off and get an MBA, not until I had run away to Italy to teach English for a year. You can imagine my parents' concern at this point. Eventually, I go get an MBA, and I land as an entry-level salesperson at AT&T. This was when AT&T was a vastly larger company than it is today. There were literally 1 million employees at AT&T. I was a young woman in a man's world. Not a lot of people looked like me. And in fact, the very first meeting I ever had with clients was in a strip club in downtown Washington, D.C., because that's where men went to have lunch with their clients. And if I wanted to do my job, I thought I needed to meet my clients. It's a different time now in some ways, and not so different in other ways, as we're finding out in the headlines. One of the, I'll come back to that if you like when we have questions and answers. One of the things that when I landed, I wasn't what you'd call credentialed. You know, I wasn't a guy, first of all. I didn't have loads of great degrees. And so one of my first challenges was to be taken seriously. A lot of people didn't take me seriously. And everywhere I went, I would find problems along the way. And one client in particular had a very pressing problem, and I thought that we ought to be able to solve it. And so I went lots of places in the company, and nobody took me seriously. But eventually somebody said to me, you know, you need to meet this guy, this technical expert. His name is Frank Fiorina. And I went to meet him. And that was about 36 years ago, and he took me seriously. He solved my problem. He was really cute. I had to marry him. And he is here. So my husband, Frank, is right down here. Now, I'm not going to drag you through point by point my entire long career. What I'm going to say is this. Leaders, you know what my life proves? Leaders can come from the most unlikely places, the most unlikely circumstances. And you will hear people say sometimes, leaders are born. Not true. Leaders are made. And in fact, I know for a fact that anybody and everybody can lead. And so I want to tell you about what I've learned about leadership along the way. The first thing I learned along the way, I told you I wandered throughout AT&T, this big, humongous corporation, but I've learned it's the same no matter where you go, whether it's a government agency or a university or a nonprofit. No matter where you go, there are festering problems. Problems that have been left to fester for a long time. Everyone knows they're there. Everyone, in fact, usually spends enormous amounts of energy working around the problems, pretending the problems aren't there, bitching about the problems. But they fester. That's part of it. Everywhere I went, everywhere I've ever been, I see festering problems. But here's the other thing I've learned. The people who are impacted by those problems, they actually have some interesting ideas about how to solve them. It's just most of the time nobody asks them. Everywhere I went, I found festering problems, and I would ask the people who were impacted by them, well, what do you think we should do about this? And amazingly, they always had really good ideas. I could tell you one story in particular about a guy named Jim. Jim was an engineer who worked for me. Jim, you would have never noticed Jim. Jim was one of these guys who sat in his cubicle all day long. He didn't talk to anybody really. He brought his lunch into work. He kind of ate lunch at the same time by himself, came at the same time, left at the same time. Nothing remarkable about Jim. And one day, I went to talk to Jim, and I asked him about his work and what he was doing. And Jim, this was back in the dark ages of telecommunications, but Jim's job as an engineer was to design circuits. And he said, you know, Carly, I design circuits all day long, and then we pass them off to a company to build those circuits, and then the company bills us, charges us for those circuits. And you know, I've noticed that the bills that they charge us don't match the designs that I sent them. And I said, well, Jim, do you think that's a problem? He said, yeah, I do. I said, well, what would you do about that problem? Well, what I would do is get a bunch of people to look at those bills and compare them to my circuit designs. I said, well, Jim, I think you ought to do that. So we hired a bunch of temporary people, Kelly girls, as a matter of fact, men and women, and they started checking the bills. Jim saved our company $300 million in a single year. Nobody thought he was anybody, but he had the potential to see that problem and to understand how maybe to solve that problem. There are problems everywhere. People actually do know what it would make it better if someone will only ask. And everybody has potential, a lot more than they realize. Everybody is gifted by God. Somehow those two men all those years ago saw potential in me, and because they did, I saw possibilities in myself that I didn't know were there. And Jim was the same way. Or I could tell you about a woman I met in India. As was mentioned, I was chairman of an organization called Opportunity International. Opportunity International is the largest private microfinance organization in the world. Microfinance, as you may know, is the process of loaning very small amounts of money to very poor people. You see, people are not poor in most cases because they are not gifted by God. They are not poor because they have no desire to have a better life. They're poor because they don't have a chance. They don't have an opportunity. And imagine for a moment if you literally could not get credit for anything. If you had to live hand to mouth on less than $1 a day, it'd be tough to get ahead. And so microfinance is the process of lending very small amounts of money, $100 actually, and accompanying that loan with training and entrepreneurship and innovation. Opportunity International has lent about $8 billion, $100 at a time. And we have lifted literally millions and millions of people out of poverty. So, I was running a global board meeting in New Delhi, India. And at the end of that global board meeting, I wanted to go meet with some of our clients. And so I traveled to the slums. Now, I don't know how many of you have been in the slums of New Delhi. but they're pretty grim. Mountains of trash, marauding animals, sewage in the streets, people piled on top of each other. It is a desperate set of circumstances. And as I climbed up a ladder to get to a rickety rooftop to meet with some of our clients, I was steeling myself because I expected to see desperation in these women's, they were all women, in these women's eyes, because their circumstances were desperate. And it's hard to look into someone's eyes and see desperation looking back. But when I sat down, that's not what I saw. I saw pride, I saw focus, I saw determination, I saw hope. And one woman in particular, I remember, she told me that she had been very afraid to take this loan. She came from a very traditional family in this region in India. And in her family, in her culture, women didn't do this. And she said, for a long time, my husband said I couldn't do this. My in-laws said I couldn't do this. Her in-laws lived with her, which was traditional in that culture. And finally, she got the courage somehow to take this loan. I said, well, what does your family think now? And she said, oh, they're happy they work for me. Now, the truth is, we had done much more for this woman, this nameless, faceless woman in the slums of New Delhi, who now employed her family, who had built a business. Her business was car covers, believe it or not, replacing seat covers in cars. We had done far more for her than give her a loan. That was really important. Or train her. That was really important. But the most important thing we had done was say to her and others like her, you have value. You have potential. You have possibilities. You have God-given gifts. And you can, with help, build a life of dignity and purpose and meaning. You see, everyone is capable of that. Everyone is gifted by God, and everyone has more potential than they realize. People can solve problems that impact them if they are given the opportunity and the support to do so. Now, we're in America, so I have to say, those two things that I learned along the way sort of are at the core of who we are supposed to be as a nation. If you actually read the Constitution, it's about a couple big ideas. One big idea is that everybody has potential. We talk in the Constitution, our founders talked about God-given rights. Rights that cannot be taken away by a monarch or a sovereign or a government. In this country, citizens are sovereign. Citizens are sovereign. Not the government, not the president, not some bureaucracy, citizens. And we've had to work really hard to make sure that those God-given rights, that sovereignty that rests in a citizen, applies to everybody, regardless of who you are, where you come from, or how you start, regardless, in other words, of your circumstances. But having studied a lot of history, having lived and worked all over the world, I think it is accurate to say that this is the only country in history and on the face of the earth that was founded on such an amazing idea, that people are gifted by God and that they have rights that come from God, and that therefore sovereignty rests with the individual. The second thing, of course, that our Constitution says, if you read it, is that problems should be solved locally. Whenever possible, problems should be solved locally, and that's smart, because the people who are impacted by a problem probably understand it better than people thousands of miles away, although we've forgotten that. I'll tell you one other thing I learned in the course of my life. I don't care whether it's a company, a nonprofit, a government, a university, dare I say, it doesn't matter. In any institution, if you concentrate too much power for too long in too few hands, power will be abused. The concentration of power leads to the abuse of power. And it also leads to money being wasted and decisions being generally ineffective. And so the other thing in the Constitution is, guess what? If you read the Constitution, what it basically is about, it's a blueprint for how to avoid the concentration of power. It is a blueprint that says, you know, the federal government should only do certain things and actually not very many things. Boy, have we come a long way from that. And the people who should be solving problems are who? Sovereign citizens, communities, civil society. In our history, civil society has been powerful. Our founding documents make it powerful, and yet I feel as though as citizens and civil society, we have chosen not to use our power. We have let our power wane, and we keep, and this is a bipartisan comment, we keep sending more and more and more problems to be solved by someone else. I got involved in politics when I realized that politicians, the policies they pursue, they impact every single person's life, for better or for worse. But I also believe that civil society and citizens, we need to step up to do our part. And that means, I believe, that each one of us needs to understand that we can lead wherever we are, and that we can make progress on the problems that impact us and those around us. We don't have to wait for someone else. And so let me say a bit about what leadership is. And I've learned this in the course of my life too. If you had woken me up as a young woman about to graduate from college and said, you're going to be a leader, you're going to run for president, you're going to be a CEO, I would have laughed. I would have laughed relatively recently at the you're going to run for president. But I have no regrets about that. In any event, what have I learned about leadership? The first thing that I would say is I think we're really confused about leadership. I think we think what I used to think. What I used to think was that a leader was whoever had the big office, the big title. I thought leadership was the same as position, title. If you have a big position, if you have a big title, if you have perks, if you have got a big budget, you must be a leader. And then I looked around and I noticed that there were people with big offices, big titles, sometimes big egos to go along with it, and they were not leading. Leadership is not about position or title. There are people with position and title who lead, but it's not because of their position and title. Leadership also is not the same as management. Managers can be leaders and leaders can be managers, but they are not the same thing. Here's what a manager is. A manager is someone who produces results, does the best they can within existing constraints and conditions. Very important management, but it's not leadership. A leader changes constraints and conditions. A leader challenges the status quo. A leader does not allow a problem to fester. A leader does something about it. And that's different than a manager. Leadership is not about position or title. Leadership is about solving problems. Leadership is about producing results that make a difference, that make a positive difference. And so I talked all the way at the beginning about boiling things down to their essence. What's the core? I believe the core of leadership is four things, and these four things are available to every single one of us as human beings. The first thing a leader needs to have is courage. Why courage? Not ego, courage. Well, the first reason you need courage is because it's hard to challenge the status quo without it. The reason problems fester is because people don't want to challenge the system. They don't want to challenge the way things are. I don't mean just rabble-rousing. I mean challenging the status quo for the purpose of making things better. But the reason it's hard to challenge the status quo is because no matter what it is, even if it's incredibly difficult, even if it's incredibly unsatisfactory, people are invested in it. There are people who have won in it. And people want to keep what they have, or they're afraid of what they don't have. It doesn't make people bad. It makes them human. The status quo is powerful because people are invested in it, and people want to keep what they have. Or, such as the woman in India, they're afraid of what they don't have. And so it takes courage to stand up against that. It also takes courage because what happens every time you challenge the status quo? Every time you say, why is this problem festering? Why can't this woman open a business to help feed her family? You get what? Criticized. Someone is going to say, well, because we don't do it that way. We've tried that. That's not going to work. There's endless amounts of criticism. And so a leader has to have the courage to try something different, number one. That means taking a risk, and the courage to withstand the ultimate criticism that will come. In fact, what I've learned is criticism is the price of leadership. Criticism is the price of leadership. If no one is criticizing you, guess what? You're not making a difference. And you, in this era of social media, boy, you need to get courageous and get a thick skin far more than I had to, because on Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it, whatever you do, somebody's going to criticize. If you let what other people say about you define your life, please don't let that happen. Criticism is the price. If you do anything, you're going to get criticized. So decide what you want to do, and let the chips fall where they may. I don't read stuff about myself, because if I read the stuff about myself, if I read the good stuff about myself, I got to believe it, and that might go to my head. If I believe the bad stuff about myself, I might believe it, and that will go to my heart. And neither one of those things are good. Second thing I've learned about leadership, so you got to be courageous. The second thing I've learned about leadership is you have to have character. You know about character. It's why you're here. But character is such an old-fashioned word these days, and honestly, I think our culture writ large celebrates anything but character. We celebrate controversy, we celebrate conflict, we celebrate outrageous. The more outrageous, the better. But character is knowing there is a difference between right and wrong, and there is. Character is knowing that two wrongs don't make a right. Character is knowing that the ends do not always justify the means. Character is knowing that how you get things done is as important as what you get done, and says as much about you. And character is also knowing the difference between a short-term win and a long-term victory. And leaders without character are focused on solving the wrong problems, or they're focused on themselves. Because the final aspect of character is a willingness to accept that there is something bigger than ourselves, more important than ourselves. The third thing that leadership takes is collaboration. Collaboration. Working with others to solve a problem. There is nothing worth doing in this life that can be done with one person acting alone. Nothing. Everything worth doing is a collaboration. Everything. And so to collaborate, by the way, to solve problems frequently means that we're collaborating with people that might be different than we are. You know, one of the things about human nature, I think, is we are all most comfortable with people like ourselves. We're most comfortable with people that look like us, that have the same background as us, that sound like us. It's just human nature. It doesn't make us bad. But unfortunately, when we hang out with only people like us, or only people who agree with us, then we actually aren't able to collaborate effectively to solve a problem. We have to reach out. That's certainly the case to solve any problem you can name in the community of which you are a member, and in this nation. People who are different have to collaborate. And in order to be able to collaborate effectively, particularly with people different than you need humility. Humility. Humility is knowing you can't do it all by yourself. Humility is knowing you're not the most important thing. Humility is saying, hey, I need help. I don't have all the answers. Humility. One of the reasons I think people of faith make better leaders is because our faith teaches us humility. We know there is something far more important than we are. Collaboration also requires empathy. And empathy is the ability to actually see someone else, not their circumstances, not their appearance, not their opinion, not their past, to see someone and to hear someone. That requires empathy. And I think faith teaches us empathy as well, because we know that any one of us can fall and every one of us can be redeemed. Empathy. Without empathy, there is no collaboration, and without collaboration, there is no problem solving. And the final thing that a leader needs, I think, and I actually think faith helps us with this as well, is one word for it would be optimism. But the more accurate description of it, I think, is to say that leaders see possibilities. Leaders see possibilities. There are people you have met and will continue to meet along the way that walk into a set of circumstances and see all the problems and also see all the limitations and the constraints. Yeah, I mean, this is really a mess, but hey, you know what? They're not going to let me do this. I can't do that. We've already tried the other thing. In other words, they talk themselves into there's nothing we can do. And then there are people who will walk into exactly the same set of circumstances and see possibilities. But we haven't tried this, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. Optimism is the belief that things can be better. Optimism is the faith that people will rise to the occasion. Seeing possibilities allows a leader to say, yes, in fact, we can collaborate and solve this problem together because we actually know how to make it better. We may not know it all, but we know how to make it better. Leaders see possibilities, and leaders seize possibilities by unlocking potential in people all around them. And so all the way back to the beginning, when I was that secretary a long time ago, I thought the guy in the big office was the leader, but in truth, the real leaders in that building were the two men who came to my desk and said, "You can do more." They were leaders because they saw possibilities, and they helped me seize possibilities. And that, seeing possibilities in others, finding the possibilities and the God-given gifts in ourselves, that is available to us all. Our country will not solve its problems. Our country will not achieve its potential unless we, as members of civil society, we as citizens decide that part of what comes along with our God-given gifts is the gift of leadership. And I believe we all have it because courage is available to us all and character is available to us all. And each of us have the opportunity to collaborate and can find humility and empathy, and yes, we can all see possibilities. And so I would close with this, and then I will take your questions. Whatever your future holds, know that you have built a solid foundation. You have built a solid foundation. You are building a solid foundation here, not just of an education and a degree, but a solid foundation in knowing that values and faith and family and community matter. And as you go on in your life and build on that foundation, remember this: you can lead. You can make problems better. You can collaborate with others. The highest calling of a leader is to serve by solving problems. The highest calling of a leader is to unlock potential in others. Choose to do this, because in the end, it is a choice. What separates those who lead from those who don't lead is not capability, it's not education, it's not background, it's not parentage, it's not appearance. It is choice. Choose to lead. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Carly, for your inspirational and uplifting talk. That was amazing. And also for reminding us that our faith can inform the business practices that we have and can create all the conditions necessary for great leadership, which is why we're all here at the school and trying to really learn how to become great and faithful leaders. We now have time for some questions, so who would like to start off?
Do you have a mic? Is that the way this works, or should I just call on people? All right, there's a gentleman right here. And the lights are a little bright, so you're going to have to, like, really wave. Okay, sir, there you go.
Thank you, Carly, for coming. I really appreciate your talk. I learned a lot. Thank you. And
You're
I was
welcome.
a supporter of you in the primaries. And I'm
Thank you
sad
so much. Well, who knows? I may do it again someday, so, get ready.
My question was that, are you planning on running for political office again? Because you have one supporter here who will help you.
Well, thank you. You know, I have made a decision not to run for the Senate in Virginia next year. That was one that was rumored, but that doesn't rule out every other run in the future. So I would say never. One has to have the right set of circumstances, but I've learned a heck of a lot and would be ashamed to put all that to waste, wouldn't it? So you leave me your card afterwards. Yes, do you have someone ready there?
Hi, Carly. Also as a supporter and worker for
Thank
your
you.
campaign in New Hampshire.
I like the T-shirt.
Thank you.
Stand up, show everybody that T-shirt. Team Carly, there you go.
Team Carly. And having the honor to work for you.
Let me just say we had the best swag, for sure. Okay, go ahead.
Having the honor to work for you was the honor of a lifetime, truly. And my question to you is, as a history major, I read the writings of George Washington, and he wrote that a citizenry must be cultivated in virtue and faith in order to be worthy of self-government. And I think that in business and politics, there's a war on religion and faith. How do we get past that? And being here at the Catholic University, we're taught the faith and we go to church, but other universities don't teach that anymore. So the leaders that we're grooming for the future don't have that, but we do. How do we get past that?
Well, that's a big question, obviously, and I can't do it justice in a minute, but I would say a couple things. George Washington, interestingly, warned us about something else in that same genre. He warned us about the rise of political parties. He said the problem with political parties is they will care so much about winning that they will stop thinking about values and governing. And I don't know, we may have kind of arrived at that point. I think it starts, yes, in many cases there is a war on religion. I can remember my very first breakfast meeting with your president and him telling me this horrendous story. I hope you don't mind if I share it publicly. Here he is, the president of Catholic University, reduced to going to the offices of HHS and trying to explain to a bureaucrat, a nameless, faceless government bureaucrat, why the contraception mandate in Obamacare was a problem for the values of this school. Unbelievable, really. Let us start, however, by saying that if we want to have others come to faith, then we need to live our faith. We need to live our faith. I am sure, I hope all of you do. But part of living our faith means that we must engage in civil discourse, not disrespectful discourse. Part of living our faith means we cannot insult others just because they disagree with us. Part of living our faith means we can't do a deal with the devil just because we think we're going to get the right political aims. In other words, if we want more people to be more faithful, sometimes we need to be more faithful. And we need to show people what a life of faith is. Look, I will tell you this. Really, truly, I've learned this over and over and over in my life. Most people, the vast majority of people, are good people. There are some evil ones in the world, but most aren't. And most good people want to live a life of dignity and purpose and meaning. And most of the time, when people are invited into a community of faith and treated respectfully, they find dignity and purpose and meaning in that. And so those of us of faith can't attack others because they have a different faith. And we can't be disrespectful of people because they look different. And unfortunately, our political discourse is everything that we people of faith believe it should not be. I'm not making a partisan comment. But if you look at our political discourse today, what do you find? Disrespect? Insults? This is not a faithful way of having a dialogue. So, let's stand up and live our faith and be more inviting, perhaps, as a result. So the young lady right there, and then I'm going to come back over here. I know you have one queued all up. If the folks with the mics could just queue them up for me, in other words, hand it to someone and then wave your arm, that'd be awesome. Yes.
I wrote down my question.
Oh, you wrote it. See, when a reporter does this, it's bad news. But I'm going to give you a break. Go ahead.
First, I would like to say thank you for coming to speak to us. Your speech was very empowering. Your journey from being a Kelly girl to a CEO is an amazing accomplishment. I know that being a woman in a male-dominated workplace is difficult. So how or where did in your journey find your encouragement or source of courage to continue? Mm-hmm. And what advice do you have for us young women who want to go into the workforce?
Yeah. So first, I would say it is factually true that the generation of women in America today, growing up, are the most educated, empowered generation of women in the history of the world. That's a fact. But it is also a fact that it is still different for women. It is still different for women in many ways. Yes, we've seen all these horrible headlines of harassment. That is an abuse of power by men over women. That still goes on in every workplace. I've been harassed plenty of times. And sadly, you may be. The second thing that's different for women is that women are not given the presumption of competence. When a man walks into a job, people will presume he is qualified and competent. In other words, they will give him the benefit of the doubt. Women will not be given the benefit of the doubt. Women will have to prove it over and over and over. And that is different. I could tell you stories about men who harassed me. The man who took me to the strip club to meet my clients. The man who introduced me to my first set of subordinates as, "This is Carly, our token bimbo." I could tell you stories all day long, but I could also tell you stories about the two men who came to my desk and said, "We see possibilities in you." I could tell you stories about the man who said, "You can do this job, I'm going to give you this job." And so my advice to you would be this: you will meet people, men and women, meaning this applies to you men in the audience as well as the women in the audience. Every single one of us meets two kinds of people in our journey. There's the kind of people who tear you down, and there's the kind of people who lift you up. Men who tear women down are a particular type. And for all the reasons I said, yes, it's still different for women. There's more attention to what we look like and what we wear and all the rest of it. For heaven's sakes, all the commentary about my hair. I felt like we had finally maybe made progress when people started commenting about Donald Trump's hair. Wow, okay, we've reached some level of equivalency. But on a serious note, do not let the people who want to tear you down get under your skin. Do not let them get in your head or get in your heart. And that's why the people who tear you down, whether it's on Twitter or next door in your classroom or in your job, don't let them get under your skin. Go to the people who lift you up because they're there. There are loads of them. And so my advice to you in brief would be this. Don't get a chip on your shoulder. Don't get a chip on your shoulder. But don't hide your light under a bushel either. You be as good as you are. You do everything you want to do and find the people who will lift you up.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Your talk was incredible and super empowering. So my question is, as a leader, how do you overcome your weaknesses?
Well, first you have to have people around you who will help you discover what they are and will tell you what they are. So that means, when I was coming up initially in the work world, we didn't have the term mentors. Now everybody uses mentors. We're mentored, and people would ask me, well, who are your mentors? Look, the most important thing, I think, is somebody to tell you the truth. So maybe your mentor is not somebody high up above you. Maybe your mentor is your husband. Frank thinks his job is to tell me the truth, Maybe your mentor is somebody who works for you. Maybe your mentor is your pastor, but someone to tell you the truth, so that you know what those strengths and weaknesses are. It's important to know your strengths. It's important to know your weaknesses. And then, when you learn what your weaknesses are, surround yourself with people who will make up for those weaknesses. This is why diversity is important. This is why we shouldn't always cling to people like us. When you see management teams that look all the same, they are missing something big. So, for example, one of my weaknesses, and by the way, what you'll learn as you go on in life, is sometimes your greatest strength can also be a weakness. I have a great strength. I can see possibilities. I can see big possibilities. It's a great strength. But it can also be a weakness because I kind of ignore all the, wow, but we have to get from point A to point B and we got to march along the path here. And so, one of the things I've learned to do is put people around me, and I always have someone who's like this. It's my chief of staff now. It was my chief financial officer when I was HP. Put someone right next to me who has exactly the opposite strength, who maybe has a hard time seeing the possibilities, but boy, he knows or she knows how to get from point A to point B to point C, because you need both. Know yourself. Boy, is that old and true advice from philosophers all across the ages. Know yourself. Come to know yourself. Don't be afraid of your weaknesses, but make up for them.
Thank you.
Who has the mic? Okay?
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. As a woman, it's so empowering to hear you speak and to hear your story. My first question is kind of, how have you seen female empowerment, or just treating people with dignity? How have you seen that change the cultures that you enter? And then how can we work to dignify people, especially I love the idea of microfinancing and things like that.
We talked about living our faith. Sometimes I think we get so caught up in a really, really big idea, or so caught up in a big problem with a big label, that we forget what's right in front of us and the impact that we as an individual can have. So what do I mean by that? We talked about There's a war on religion. Boy, that's a big idea, big problem, big title. And one way of making it better is to live our faith every single day in a way that is inviting to others. It's not the only answer, but it is part of an answer. So what I would say on women's empowerment, big idea, big problem. I'll tell you a very small story to try and illustrate it. When I became a boss for the very first time, wow, I'm a boss, I have subordinates, and virtually every single one of my subordinates was much older than I was, and a man. And okay, they're not really thrilled with this idea, and I'm terrified. So what I find helpful always is to go sit down and talk to people. Go talk to people. Not tweet, go talk. So I went and sat down with this one particular man, and he was a very, very good, he was in customer service, Don. His name was Don. He was very good at it. We sat down, Don, hi, I'm Carly, and he comes right out and says, yeah, I'm not happy with this. I'm not happy with this. And I said, oh, well, tell me why. I've never worked for a woman. I don't want to work for a woman. I'm not happy about this. I mean, he was hostile. Okay. Don, tell me what you do. Tell me what you do. Well, he told me. I said, tell me about problems you encounter. He told me. What would make that problem better? He had some ideas. I said, well, what if we actually went and did that? Well, now he's intrigued. He may not like me, he may not like the idea of working for me, but you know what? Maybe I can actually help him get something done. So we started collaborating, and I helped him to get something done. And about 6 months later, I asked my team for feedback. I think it's always important to ask your team for feedback, somebody to tell you the truth. How am I doing? And this particular gentleman, Don, said to me, you know, Carly, you're an exception. That's how it always starts. I mean, I don't like working for women, and I don't want to work for women, but I like working for you. I want to work for you. You're a great boss. In other words, instead of tackling the big problem of women's empowerment and this guy doesn't want to work for me, I started with, Don, let's just see if you and I can work together. And at the end of 6 months of working together, guess what? He changed his mind. Now, he might have changed his mind one person at a time, but it was progress. We were making progress. And I'll guarantee you, after 2 years, his mind was a little more open. Meet people where they are. See them where they are. Don't get all hung up on a big, huge problem, and assume the best in people for as long as you can. Yes, okay. You got to wave if you got the mic here.
All right, sorry, my question relates to your idea of seeking possibilities, and there were two main examples that you brought up, which I just thought were relate so well to what you were saying in your talk. And the first piece of that is where you're dealing with microfinance, the woman who you could definitely tell had hope in her eyes, and that she wanted to be able to, for her family and for the people around her, create a brighter future. And the second example was the engineer who felt that he was in a cubicle all the time, but he was still able to do the job that he was focused on. And my question specifically is the idea of, I guess I'm coming from Seattle, and I've seen a lot of people who are my age and even older who feel like they don't have that opportunity to seek possibilities, to seek entrepreneurship. And I'm just curious what you think, how can we get those kind of people who kind of feel a little bit left out to be able to seek their own possibilities and seek their own future?
Yeah. Well, this is one of the reasons why I do so much work today through the Unlocking Potential Foundation with nonprofit organizations, because there are a lot of nonprofits who are embedded in communities who are dealing with incredibly difficult and festering problems, whether it's poverty or addiction or violence or lack of education. I mean, these are pressing, festering problems, and yet there are people in those communities. And so what I spend a great deal of my time doing is going into these organizations and teaching them, helping them practice leadership. Here's the thing. Most of the time, the most important first step in having a person feel as though there are possibilities in front of them is to acknowledge them. Literally, something as basic as, I see you. You have possibilities. To be acknowledged with respect and actually seen with empathy and respect. It's so important. Not just as a statistic, not just as somebody, I don't know, you don't look like me, but actually a soul, to your point, of living our faith. And the next thing is to say, whatever the problem is that that person is grappling with, there are people around them who know how to make it better. And so the question is, can you help people learn their capacity for leadership and problem solving? I think it can be taught. I've spent a lot of time teaching it. I know it can be learned. The thing is, if you ask people, if you say to someone who's, let's say, mired in poverty and without an education or maybe struggling with addiction, if you say to somebody in that set of circumstances, we're going to teach you how to build your own business, you're talking about another planet. Maybe the first step for them is getting through a day. In other words, you got to start with where people are, and people have to walk before they run. But the fundamentals, you have potential. You can solve problems. You do have the capacity for leadership. There are people around you who will lift you up, and I see all of that. Starting with that basic has huge impact. And so that's why I would say to all of you, yes, we can all wring our hands and be truly worried, rightfully worried, about big problems from nuclear war to women's empowerment, and yet we must not underestimate our own impact. Do not underestimate your own impact. And do not underestimate the simple impact of looking someone in the eye with respect and seeing them and asking them a question.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fiorina.
That's the hook.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.